Hello, wonderful listeners of Sci-Fi Stories, and thank you for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to operate. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1, so our writers and narrators can cover their living expenses and continue bringing these universes to life for you. You can support the channel by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. We truly appreciate your help. Now, let us begin our journey. For 50,000 years, the Valorian Empire did not rule the galaxy with the crude brutality of plasma batteries or kinetic bombardments. Violence was considered a vulgarity of lesser species, an inefficient expenditure of resources. Instead, they governed through an absolute monopoly on the very lifeblood of the cosmos, Ethereum. This dark matter current, flowing like an invisible, ubiquitous river beneath the fabric of space, provided infinite energy and instantaneous transit across millions of star systems. The Valorians had mapped it, harnessed it, and most importantly, they had installed the floodgates. When a vassal world inevitably grew too proud, when a burgeoning civilization whispered of rebellion or demanded sovereignty, the empire did not dispatch armadas. They simply turned the valve. They severed the Ethereum connection. The rebellious world would instantly go dark. Their atmospheric scrubbers would halt. Their orbital platforms would plummet from the sky. Their agricultural fabricators would freeze. Within weeks, the silent, bloodless grip of starvation and technological collapse would strangle the rebellion into absolute submission. It was a sterile, clinical subjugation, mathematically perfected and entirely inescapable. Deep within the great observatory on the capital world of Prime Valor, this exact mathematical perfection was being observed. The chamber was a marvel of architectural arrogance, a colossal dome of crystalline lattice suspended over a sea of liquid silver data streams. High Overseer Kalen stood alongside a silent assembly of foreign diplomats, their eyes fixed on a massive, slow-turning holographic projection in the center of the room. It was the SETI Alpha system. 2 weeks prior, its inhabitants had demanded representation in the High Council. Today, their punishment was on display. The diplomats watched in cold, suffocating silence as the vibrant blue streams of Ethereum retracted from the system's grid. The hologram shifted, showing the cascading failure of the planet's power grids, turning continents into black voids. No one spoke. The message was absolute. Resistance was not just futile, it was suicidal. This was the eternal order of the universe, unyielding and unbreakable. Then, the impossible happened. It lasted for precisely 1 millisecond. The blinding, ever-present hum of the Prime Valor Ethereum manifold faltered. The grand holographic projection of the dying star system flickered violently, tearing into static before restabilizing. The liquid silver data streams beneath their feet froze in their channels. Across the entire galaxy, spanning millions of light-years, the Ethereum network experienced a simultaneous, inexplicable pressure drop. A murmur rippled through the ranks of the terrified diplomats. But High Overseer Kalen remained perfectly rigid. His multifaceted eyes narrowed at the central console. In 50,000 years of recorded history, the Ethereum had never fluctuated. It was a physical impossibility, akin to gravity momentarily deciding to cease its pull. "Report," Kalen commanded, his voice a smooth, synthesized chime that betrayed no emotion. A sub-overseer frantically manipulated the geometric interface of the scanning array. Anomaly detected at the absolute perimeter of the Orion Spur. High Overseer, massive energetic displacement, but it is not a warp signature. It is not a hyperspace transit. "Explain," Kalen demanded. "The fabric of reality itself," the technician replied, his voice trembling for the first time in his long, sterilized life. Space-time is not being folded or bypassed. It is being violently torn open. The grand hologram shifted away from the dying SETI Alpha system, focusing instead on the desolate, empty sector at the edge of the galactic map. The image magnified thousands of times. There, against the backdrop of the cosmic void, a jagged, bleeding fissure in real space hung open like a fresh wound. It defied every law of Valorian physics. It was ugly, raw, and terrifying. From the depths of that glowing, violently weeping tear, a singular silhouette pushed its way into the physical universe. The diplomats gasped, stepping back from the projection. Kalen stepped forward. The vessel that emerged possessed no elegant, shimmering energy shields. It lacked the smooth, organic geometries of Valorian design. It was a brutalist monolith of scarred, dull alloy, forged in sharp angles and heavy armor plating. Most shocking of all, its aft section did not glow with the pristine, sapphire light of Ethereum transit drives. Instead, it expelled furious, violent torrents of raw, hyper-accelerated plasma. It was propelled by a fusion engine, a dirty, crude technology, classified as prehistoric scrap by the Empire, long before they conquered their first star. Yet, despite its primitive nature, the ship radiated an aura of immense, undeniable mass. It moved with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a predatory leviathan. As the monolithic vessel slowly rotated, catching the starlight of the Orion Spur, the high-resolution sensors mapped the port side of its massive hull. Etched into the scarred metal was a faded, archaic symbol, a blue and green sphere, orbited by a single gray moon. Beneath it, carved in blocky, uncompromising letters, was a word that had been erased from Imperial archives 10,000 years ago. Earth. A suffocating, deathly silence descended upon the great observatory. Not a single diplomat dared to breathe. The data streams hummed a low, ominous frequency. Humanity, the stubborn, primitive species that had arrogantly refused the Empire's gift of Ethereum, the species that the Valorian historical texts recorded as having driven themselves into self-inflicted extinction 10,000 years ago, had not died. They had not faded into the dark. They had returned. The command deck of the Valorian, super dreadnought Apex Vanguard, was usually a sanctuary of whispered orders and serene confidence. Today, it felt like the crushing depths of an abyssal trench. The air was thick, suffocating under the heavy weight of the impossible. Supreme Commander Vane stood at the center of the tactical holotable, his ceremonial armor feeling unusually tight against his chest. He stared intensely at the singular, jagged blip pulsing on the three-dimensional tactical grid. To preserve the grand illusion of absolute dominance, Vane had not sent a mere patrol squadron. He had mobilized an entire armada. Exactly 5,000 Vanguard-class warships had dropped simultaneously from the Ethereum current, forming a perfectly spherical, inescapable cage around the intruder. 5,000 shimmering spears of flawless, elegant geometry, their Ethereum cores pulsing in a synchronized, intimidating rhythm, all aimed directly at a single brutalist wedge of dark, scarred metal. It was a display of overwhelming, completely unnecessary force, designed specifically to crush not just the physical ship, but the very concept of defiance. Yet, the atmosphere on the Valorian bridge was not one of impending triumph or pride. It was soaked in a creeping, cold sweat. "Tactical analysis," Vane ordered, his voice clipped and sharp, shattering the tense silence of the room. A senior sensor officer, his multi-jointed hands trembling slightly over the smooth glass controls, reported the findings. "Commander, the scan results are entirely defying logic. The vessel possesses zero offensive capabilities. There are no plasma batteries, no kinetic launchers, no torpedo bays. It lacks even the most basic spectral energy shields. Structurally, it is primitive beyond reckoning, comprised of solid, unrefined alloys stacked upon each other. Vane sneered, his mandibles clicking in disdain. A flying tomb! They have dragged their own coffin out of the prehistoric dirt to die a second time. Sir, there is a severe anomaly, the officer interrupted, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper, sounding much like a sonar operator detecting a sea monster in the dark. The mass readings. The vessel is relatively small, roughly the size of a standard cruiser, but its material density is registering at impossible metrics. It does not read like a hollow starship. It reads like the compressed, solid core of a dying neutron star. The passive gravitational shear it is exerting on local space is immense. Vane dismissed the warning with a harsh, sweeping wave of his hand. Panic was a dangerous contagion he would not allow to spread on his deck. Sensory malfunction caused by the spatial tear. It is a lifeless piece of scrap, and we will reduce it to scattered atoms. All ships. Synchronized targeting. Let them witness the fire of the eternity they rejected. Fire on my mark. Fire. Across the vast, spherical blockade, 5,000 pristine warships opened their primary weapon ports. Space itself seemed to recoil as thousands of concentrated Ethereum lances ignited simultaneously. The black void was instantly illuminated by a blinding, sapphire inferno. A concentrated convergence of raw, world-shattering energy, all intersecting at one tiny coordinate in the center. It was a combined strike that would have vaporized a small moon in a fraction of a second. The Valorian bridge crew reflexively shielded their optical receptors from the blinding glare flashing across the tactical monitors. Then, the piercing light faded. The tactical officers leaned forward, holding their breath, waiting for the sensor grid to confirm the target's total atomic disintegration. Instead, the console let out a low, rhythmic pulse, a sound resembling a solitary sonar ping cutting through deep, dark ocean water. The human ship hung exactly where it had been, utterly untouched. It was not shielded. It had not deflected the terrible energy. It had simply absorbed it. The solid, dull metal of its hull drank the 5,000 Ethereum beams like a dry, cosmic sponge, soaking up a single droplet of water. There was no thermal bloom, no radiation spike, no structural deformation whatsoever. The world-ending energy had simply vanished into the impossible density of the craft, leaving no trace behind. A terrifying, breathless silence took hold of the Vanguard bridge. The impossible had just compounded into the absurd. Before Commander Vane could even open his mouth to issue a new order, the artificial gravity plating beneath their feet groaned violently. It was a deep, physical vibration that rattled the teeth in their skulls and shook the bulkheads. The holographic interfaces flickered wildly, not from a digital intrusion, but from an overwhelming physical distortion. "Are we being hacked?" Vane demanded, bracing himself hard against the command console to keep from falling. "Negative!" the communications officer shouted in a panic over the groaning metal. "Our data streams are secure. Our firewalls are untouched. This is a purely physical intrusion. They are manipulating local gravitational waves, forcing our internal hull plating to act as an acoustic resonator. They are turning the physical structure of the ship itself into a giant speaker." The groaning vibration suddenly refined itself, smoothing out the harsh distortion until a voice filled the bridge. It did not sound angry. It did not sound triumphant, fearful, or threatening. It was calm. It was frighteningly, mathematically calm, speaking in a perfectly enunciated dialect of High Valorian that had not been spoken in the imperial courts for 10,000 years. "I am Bryant Bird, captain of the human anchor ship, the Anchor." The voice resonated deep in the chest of every alien on the deck. A literal ghost from a forgotten millennium demanding absolute attention. Vane gripped the console edge, his knuckles turning pale. "Trace that physical transmission. Find a way to scramble it." The crew scrambled frantically, but the voice continued, completely unbothered. entirely ignoring the chaos and panic it had sown among its captors. You have fired upon us. We have absorbed your kinetic and thermal transfer. But I must issue this warning to the commander of this fleet. Every time you fire an Ethereum weapon, you are not projecting energy. You are draining the blood of the universe. The current you rely on is finite, and your actions are violently destabilizing the absolute vacuum. Captain Bryant Bird paused for a few seconds, letting the silence hang heavy like a physical weight before delivering his true intent. We did not come from the dark to fight you. We came to stop you from tearing reality apart. Cease the flow of Ethereum immediately, or there will be nothing left for your empire to rule. Vane's eyes widened. A dangerous, volatile mixture of deep fear and terribly insulted pride boiling over. To his indoctrinated mind, this was not a lesson in physics. This was supreme heresy. It was the desperate, mad bluff of a resurrected corpse, trying to dictate terms to a living god. Absolute madness, Vane hissed, his rigid composure finally and entirely shattered. Lies and prehistoric superstition. They think they can sit there and absorb our fire? Let us see them absorb the fury of a dying sun. Override all safety protocols on the flagship immediately. Spool up the ether core. Commander, the chief tactical officer pleaded, his voice breaking in sheer terror. The ether core is a system killer. It is designed to crack tectonic plates. Using it at this close proximity, within our own blockade formation, the sheer backscatter alone could cripple our entire fleet. Do it! Vane roared, his voice echoing wildly over the quiet, rhythmic hum of the gravity waves. I want that ship erased from existence right now! Fire the core! Deep within the darkest bowels of the Vanguard flagship, the massive, forbidden machinery began to scream, drawing an ungodly amount of dark matter into its firing chamber, preparing to unleash a cataclysm straight at the silent, patiently waiting monolith of humanity. The titanic weapon discharged. It was not a beam of light or plasma. It was a localized, catastrophic removal of physical distance. A cylinder of pure, shrieking dark matter violently bridged the gap between the Valorian dreadnought and the primitive human vessel. The kinetic output was unquantifiable, a force specifically engineered to liquefy planetary mantles and crack tectonic plates in a fraction of a second. It slammed directly into the unshielded, dark metal of the human craft with the wrath of an insulted god. And then, the foundational laws of physics simply gave up. There was no explosive fireball. There was no triumphant shockwave of vaporized alloy, or the satisfying flare of a destroyed enemy. Instead, a sickening, impossible sound echoed through the absolute vacuum of space, transmitted directly into the auditory receptors and neural pathways of every living creature trapped in the blockade. It sounded like an infinitely massive sheet of thick ice, fracturing under impossible weight. Space itself, the unseen three-dimensional canvas of the universe, splintered. Gigantic, jagged fault lines of absolute nothingness ripped outward from the point of impact, fracturing the void like a black mirror struck by a heavy hammer. Through those jagged, glowing cracks, the terrified Valorian crews looked beyond the physical realm. They looked directly into the terrifying depths of the underweave. It was a sight that instantly shattered the fragile sanity of hundreds of veteran navigators and tactical officers across the fleet. The void behind reality was not empty. It was a blinding, chaotic loom of hyper-dimensional strings, trembling and vibrating under immense tension. And glowing vividly through the center of those infinite strings was the familiar, sapphire blue radiance of Ethereum. In that horrifying moment of cosmic revelation, the truth crashed down upon the supreme commanders of the alien armada. Ethereum was not a limitless, magical well of energy. It was entirely structural. It was the cosmic thread, sewing the dimensional membranes of the universe together, holding physical reality in place. For 50,000 years, the Valorian Empire had not been siphoning water from an infinite ocean. They had been relentlessly, ignorantly pulling the fundamental threads out of the very tapestry of reality to power their warp engines, their floating palaces, and their destructive weapons. They had built a galactic utopia by slowly unspooling the universe. The paradox of firing a weapon made of reality's structural foundation directly at an ultra-dense mass designed to manipulate it caused a catastrophic, immediate unspooling. The geometric cracks widened with terrifying speed, branching out like jagged black lightning across the spherical blockade formation. A vanguard cruiser, positioned too close to an expanding fissure, was touched by the raw, bleeding edge of the tear. It did not explode in a shower of sparks. Its internal alarms did not have time to trigger. The heavy warship, along with its highly trained crew of 2,000 souls, simply ceased to be. They were completely and instantly erased from the timeline. Their physical mass converted into emergency structural reinforcement for the collapsing void. Supreme Commander Vane stood paralyzed on his command deck, his multiple eyes wide, with a primal, unnameable dread as he watched the tactical board. Blips were not registering as destroyed. They were just vanishing. In a span of 30 seconds, 400 Vylorian warships fell into the expanding cracks and were quietly, terrifyingly deleted from existence. There were no distress calls. There was only the creeping silence of non-existence. Amidst the utter collapse of the Imperial blockade and the unraveling of the sector, the deep, vibrating hum of the gravitational transmission returned. Captain Bryant Bird's voice was no longer just a physical broadcast. It felt like the heavy, immutable voice of the cosmos itself, ringing through the vibrating bulkheads of the surviving, panicking fleet. "You see it now," the human captain stated, his tone completely devoid of vindication or triumph, holding only the heavy, clinical weariness of a terrible, ancient burden. 10,000 years ago, humanity did not flee into the dark because we feared the might of your armada. We fled because our early quantum astrophysicists calculated the inevitable end of the Ethereum equation. We saw that your grand empire was slowly, stubbornly bleeding the space-time continuum dry. When we tried to present the mathematics to your High Council, we were condemned as primitive heretics. The massive, dark silhouette of the human ship remained suspended perfectly in the center of the splintering reality, an unmovable anchor in a raging cosmic storm. So, we took our civilization into the deepest, deadest sector of the galactic rim, Bird continued. We deliberately isolated ourselves in the dead zone, starving our own technological advancement of Ethereum, to spend 10 millennia designing a single solution to stop the universe from collapsing under the weight of your greed. You noted the absurd mass of this vessel. We mechanically compressed the core of a dead star to forge this hull. The anchor is exactly what its name implies. It is a microscopic needle, carved from ultra-dense matter, utilizing immense localized gravity to pull the frayed edges of the space-time membrane back together. We came here today to drop the anchor and stitch the tear your empire created in this sector. The glowing, shattered faults in space pulsed violently once again, effortlessly devouring another 24 Vylorian ships. The dimensional bleeding was accelerating rapidly, entirely out of control. But your Supreme Commander could not look past his own absolute arrogance. Bird's voice grew noticeably colder, sharp with the grim, unforgiving mathematics of their new reality. By firing the ether core into the exact epicenter of a fragile spatial fracture, you have catalyzed a cascading dimensional failure. The tear is no longer localized to the star system. It is currently propagating outward at an exponential, unstoppable rate. A suffocating pause hung in the freezing air of the Vylorian bridges. The arrogant, untouchable gods of the galaxy were now trembling, trapped in a cage of broken glass that was actively shrinking around them. "I have run the new physical calculations," Captain Bird announced, the finality of his words echoing like a universal death knell. The gravitational mass of this single vessel is no longer sufficient to bridge the widening gap. The wound is too severe. One needle cannot close this tear. Absolute terror is a completely foreign concept to a civilization that has known nothing but absolute supremacy. On the glittering capital world of Prime Valor, the High Council watched the live telemetry of the collapsing sector in a state of catatonic denial. Their fundamental reality was disintegrating, eating their invincible armada alive, erasing their finest vessels from the timeline. Yet paralyzed by 50 millennia of unchallenged dogma, they could not comprehend a cosmic problem that could not be solved by the application of overwhelming firepower. If the fabric of space was tearing, they would simply bombard the tear until it submitted to their will. An emergency override echoed across the galactic network. Within minutes, the void surrounding the bleeding spatial fracture warped and boiled with raw energy. A massive reinforcement armada dropped violently from the Ethereum currents. 50,000 heavy dreadnoughts and battlecruisers arrived, their hull plating gleaming, their plasma batteries glowing with blind, obedient fury. Supreme Commander Vane, his mind fracturing under the weight of the cosmic horror he had unleashed, saw the arrival of the new fleet not as a warning, but as the hammer he desperately needed to smash the incomprehensible. He ordered the 50,000 newly arrived vessels to lock their targeting arrays directly onto the expanding dimensional fissure. It was the ultimate display of terminal ignorance, a desperate, pathetic illusion that brute violence could negotiate with the foundational laws of quantum physics. Aboard the dark, scarred bridge of the human vessel, Captain Bryant Bird monitored the tactical feed. He watched the massive alien armada aligning their world-ending weapons toward the very wound that was threatening to swallow the star system. A heavy sigh, carried outward through the acoustic gravity waves, vibrated across the terrified alien decks. It was a sound of profound, weary pity. The Valorian Empire was acting exactly like a drowning man trying to shoot the water that was filling his lungs. "They are preparing to fire directly into the fracture," Bird stated to his crew, his voice cold, analytical, and completely resolute. "A kinetic strike of that magnitude will shatter the dimensional membrane entirely. We must deploy the Kronos Lighthouse immediately." For 10,000 years, hidden in the lightless, frozen depths of the dead zone, humanity had not spent their exile building a sprawling, galaxy-conquering armada. They knew they could never outproduce an empire that controlled millions of worlds. They lacked the raw materials, the time, and the manpower to construct a fleet capable of matching the Valorian war machine. So, human intellect chose a completely different path. They abandoned the primitive concept of mass production. Instead, generations of the greatest minds humanity had to offer focused every ounce of their genius on constructing just one, single, absolutely perfect vessel. The Anchor was never meant to be the flagship of a vast fleet. It was the only ship humanity possessed. But during their dark isolation, humanity had mastered a science the alien empire had never even theorized: the mathematical art of time-folding. Deep within the ultra-dense core of the human ship, the Kronos Lighthouse ignited. It did not project a beam of light across physical space. It projected a quantum beacon across the multiverse. Suddenly, the violent, expanding edges of the cosmic tear stopped advancing. The jagged fault lines of absolute nothingness began to vibrate with a new, strange, harmonic frequency. From the terrifying, chaotic depths of the underweave, golden, geometric fractals blossomed like lotuses of pure mathematics. And then the cavalry arrived. They did not drop from hyperspace. They did not ride the Ethereum current. They bled through the fabric of reality itself, stepping sideways out of parallel timelines. One by one, then dozen by dozen, then thousand by thousand. Massive, brutalist wedges of dark, scarred metal emerged from the golden fractals, casting long shadows against the blinding light of the dying alien fleet. Tens of thousands of exact replicas of the human ship materialized in the void, filling the sector with an impossible, staggering amount of gravitational mass. The communication channels of the Valorian dreadnoughts were instantly overwhelmed. It was not static, but a chorus of human voices, echoing in perfect, chilling unison. Tens of thousands of identical voices, belonging to tens of thousands of variant versions of Captain Bryant Byrd, all speaking the exact same coordinate calculations at the exact same moment. They were a paradox fleet, summoned from infinite probable futures and alternate pasts, brought together for one singular, desperate purpose. The Supreme Commander of the alien armada watched in mute, paralyzed horror as the human armada moved. They did not turn their weapons toward the 50,000 Valorian dreadnoughts. They completely ignored the alien threat. Instead, the tens of thousands of human ships accelerated with terrifying precision, forming a vast, three-dimensional geometric lattice around the bleeding cosmic fracture. They positioned themselves at exact mathematical intervals, aligning their ultra-dense cores to create a unified, overlapping field of immense gravity. They were not fighting a war. They were engaging in macro-scale cosmic surgery. The combined magnetic and gravitational shear of the Paradox fleet acted like a hyper-massive tourniquet, locking the frayed, tearing edges of space-time into a rigid, unmoving hold. The violent unspooling of the universe violently halted against the sheer, unbreakable willpower of human engineering. Yet, inside the command center of the flagship, Supreme Commander Vane did not see salvation. As the human ships stabilized the tear, the glowing sapphire blue flow of the Ethereum current across the sector began to dim, choked off by the intense gravitational netting. The power grids on the Valorian ships flickered. To Vane, blinded by a lifetime of absolute supremacy and terrified of losing the singular source of his empire's godhood. This was the ultimate attack. He genuinely believed the humans were using their impossible technology to steal the Ethereum. Logic had completely abandoned him, driven by a primal, panicked need to protect his power. Vane slammed his fist onto the General Command console. He broadcasted a fleet-wide, overriding order to the 50,000 newly arrived warships. "They are cutting off the current! They are stealing our lifeblood!" Vane screamed, his voice raw with hysteria, entirely lost to madness. "Ignore the fracture. Target the human lattice. Break their formation. Fire everything you have." Against the silent protests of a dying universe, the alien armada obeyed. 50,000 warships realigned their weapon batteries, aiming directly at the human ships that were desperately holding their reality together. The Valorian Empire chose to shoot the very hands that were stitching their world back together, willingly accelerating their own doom just to preserve the fleeting illusion of control. The relentless barrage struck the human formation with the fury of a dying empire. 50,000 dreadnoughts poured their terrifying Ethereum payloads directly into the geometric lattice. The Paradox fleet, bound tightly by their own immense, interlocking gravitational tethers, could not maneuver or evade. They could not raise spectral energy shields, for their primitive designs possessed none. They could only endure, slowly, the unyielding, ultra-dense metal of the alternate human ships began to glow a violent, angry cherry red. Heavy hull plating, forged from the compressed hearts of dead stars, began to crack, warp, and splinter under the sheer, concentrated thermal punishment. In the silent, absolute cold of the vacuum, the vessels of the human Paradox fleet burned like dying embers. Bryant Byrd watched the tactical holomap as the life signs of his alternate selves began to wink out. One by one, the lattice was buckling. The gravitational tourniquet was fraying at the edges. Yet, his hands did not move to the weapon arrays. Retaliation was a mathematical waste of mass and energy. Instead, he reached for the central communication console. He gathered the raw, unedited telemetry data of the dimensional fracture, the horrifying visual and mathematical proof of the dying underweave, and he fed it directly into the Kronos lighthouse. He did not broadcast a radio signal or a plea for mercy. He weaponized the undeniable truth, using the quantum resonance of the folded timelines. Bird transmitted the raw data directly into the neural pathways of every sentient being within the sector, pushing it outward across the entire galaxy. There were no language barriers to hide behind. There was no room for political spin, imperial propaganda, or the arrogant justifications of the Valorian High Council. It was pure, unadulterated cosmic agony. A young Valorian gunnery officer on a heavy cruiser, his multi-jointed finger hovering over the firing trigger, suddenly gasped and collapsed to his knees. In his mind's eye, he did not see the manufactured glory of the Empire. He saw the frayed, bleeding threads of reality. He felt the suffocating, terrifying emptiness of the void rushing in to consume his homeworld, his family, his entire species. He saw the golden, mathematically perfect lattice of the primitive human ships desperately trying to hold his universe together, while his own weapons tore them apart. The grand illusion shattered instantly. The untouchable gods they worshipped on Prime Valor were not divine protectors. They were arrogant, terrified parasites, perfectly willing to murder the universe just to keep their comfortable, gilded thrones. On the bridge of the Valorian strike cruiser, Obsidian Edge, the captain stared at the firing coordinates on his console, then looked up at the violently burning human ships on the main view screen. He slowly turned to his communications officer. "Power down the main batteries. Cut the targeting feed immediately." "But, Captain," the officer stammered, his eyes wide with ingrained fear. "Supreme Commander Vane will have us executed for high treason." The captain placed a steady hand on the console. "There will be no executioners left if we destroy the ground we stand on. Stand down. That is a direct order." It was an unprecedented, cascading failure of totalitarian doctrine. Across the vast, chaotic battlefield, hundreds, then thousands of pristine Valorian warships simply went dark. They powered down their weapon systems, defying the screaming, hysterical orders of their supreme commanders. But the awakening did not stop with a simple mutiny. Among the massive Imperial Armada were thousands of auxiliary vessels, conscripted from the vassal races, the enslaved, and the oppressed who had been forced for generations to serve the Valorian war machine. They had no heavy Ethereum cannons to fight back against the loyalist dreadnoughts that continued to fire relentlessly upon the human lattice. So, they used the only thing they had left to give. A battered, rust-covered mining barge from the outer colonies broke formation, pushing its archaic plasma thrusters far beyond their structural limits. The massive, blocky vessel threw itself directly into the firing lane of a loyalist Valorian dreadnought. A lance of blinding Ethereum energy tore through the unshielded barge, detonating it instantly, but sparing the glowing, damaged human ship positioned directly behind it. Then, another ship moved. A civilian freighter, a repurposed planetary defense monitor, a lightly armored diplomatic shuttle. Hundreds of vessels belonging to the subjugated species of the galaxy surged forward in a chaotic, desperate, and profoundly beautiful swarm. They did not fire a single shot. They formed a living physical wall in the dark. They threw their own hulls, their own lives, into the path of the Imperial cannons, gladly absorbing the brutal punishment meant for the human paradox fleet. It was a spontaneous, fiery rebellion of pure reason and empathy. The enslaved species of the galaxy were bleeding to protect the long-dead ghosts of humanity, who were in turn bleeding to protect the very fabric of the universe. Protected by this tragic, magnificent shield of alien martyrs, the human lattice finally stabilized. The immense gravitational frequencies aligned perfectly once more, and the violent tearing of the space-time continuum shuddered to a heavy halt. The bleeding stopped. On the bridge of the prime anchor ship, Bryant Bird stood amid the smoke and violently sparking consoles of his damaged vessel. He looked at the tactical feed, watching the alien ships dying to protect his fleet. His heart was heavy with the profound, devastating beauty of their sacrifice. But his mind, sharp and uncompromisingly analytical, continued to process the terrifying mathematics of their current situation. "The lattice holds," Bird whispered to his surviving crew, his voice tight with deep sorrow. "But it is only a temporary measure. We are just applying severe pressure to a severed artery. We are holding the edges together, but they are not healing." He pulled up the localized quantum topological scans. The dimensional fabric was far too damaged to fuse on its own. The immense gravity of the Paradox fleet was keeping it from tearing further. But the moment they released their hold, the universe would violently unravel once again. "We need a catalyst," Bird stated, his eyes tracing the cold, unforgiving numbers scrolling across the glass. "The network is only stopping the bleeding. To fuse this wound permanently, we need an immense, localized release of raw kinetic energy right at the absolute center of the anomaly. It must be a purely physical collision, entirely devoid of Ethereum, possessing enough sheer brute force to shock the dimensional membranes into permanently sealing." The heavy silence following Captain Bryant Bird's analysis was broken by a horrifying realization. He opened the broad frequency once more, his voice ringing with absolute, unflinching resolve. "The Prime vessel was never designed for a return voyage," Bird announced to the billions listening across the stars. "The ultra-dense core of my ship is the final thread required to permanently bind this reality together. However, it cannot simply be placed into the void. To fuse the dimensional membrane, the core must be fractured and detonated through a pure, unadulterated physical collision of immense kinetic magnitude." Before the Allied rebel ships could even process the weight of his words, a blinding surge of energy erupted from the Valorian loyalist lines. Driven entirely mad by the crumbling of his eternal empire, Supreme Commander Vane had overridden all safety protocols on the flagship. The colossal super dreadnought, a floating city of arrogant weaponry, surged forward. Vane was not trying to attack the human lattice anymore. In a final, desperate act of parasitic greed, he was driving his massive flagship directly into the heart of the cosmic fracture, attempting to gorge his vessel on the raw, bleeding Ethereum leaking from the underweave to secure the immortality of the Imperial elite. Seeing the monstrous dreadnought accelerating toward the fragile tear, the makeshift armada of freed slaves and rebel captains ignited their thrusters. They prepared to throw their fragile hulls into the path of the behemoth, ready to sacrifice everything to prevent the final collapse. "Scatter your formations immediately," Bird's voice commanded, cutting through the chaos with piercing authority. "Clear the trajectory. Do not throw away your lives. They are bringing us exactly the kinetic mass we require." In a maneuver of breathtaking, terrifying mathematical genius, Bryant Bird completely shut down the main fusion drives of the prime human vessel. He let his ship drift dead in the void. As the Valorian super dreadnought roared toward the rift, displacing an enormous amount of spatial gravity, Bird engaged a pinpoint gravitational tether. He did not fight the flagship's pull. He harnessed it, using the overwhelming mass and velocity of the charging enemy, dreadnought. Bird executed a perfect gravitational slingshot. The human ship caught the heavy gravitational wake of the alien behemoth, whipped violently around its flank, and accelerated on a direct collision course toward the very center of the fracture, reaching velocities approaching the absolute speed of light. The impact was not a battle, it was a cosmic reset. At the exact epicenter of the dimensional tear, the brutalist wedge of the human vessel slammed head-on into the shimmering, Ethereum-bloated bow of the Valorian flagship. The ultra-dense core of the human ship pierced the alien hull like a bullet, tearing through wet paper. And then, it detonated. There was no fireball of destruction. Instead, A blinding, silent shockwave of pure, unyielding physical law erupted from the epicenter. It swept across the battlefield, washing over the burning human lattice and the terrified alien fleets. Where the shockwave passed, the jagged, screaming tears in space-time instantly zipped shut, seamlessly stitched together by the sacrificed mass of the human core. But the shockwave did not stop there. It carried a secondary, profound frequency. As it rippled outward across the galaxy, touching every star system and every Ethereum manifold, it ignited the dark matter current. In one singular, magnificent flash, the entire Ethereum network was neutralized and permanently burned away. The lifeblood of the Empire turned to harmless cosmic dust. Instantly, every piece of Valorian technology in the galaxy died. The magnificent, terrifying armada of the Supreme Commander went completely dark, transformed in a fraction of a second into harmless, silent mountains of drifting metal. The supreme dictatorial power that had strangled the stars for 50,000 years was completely stripped away in a single heartbeat, returning every species in the cosmos to a fair, equal starting line. As the blinding light faded and the universe settled into a stable, quiet peace, the golden fractals of the Kronos lighthouse began to dim. The thousands of alternate human ships, their hulls scorched and broken, slowly faded into quantum static, returning to their respective timelines. Their duty was fulfilled. Captain Bryant Bird and the original Prime vessel did not emerge from the epicenter. They had willingly woven their atoms into the very fabric of the new reality, becoming the invisible foundation of a healed universe. Decades later, the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The surviving species learned to navigate the stars using safe, conventional physics, building fusion drives and sharing knowledge freely. No new empire rose to replace the Valorian tyranny. Instead, at the exact coordinates of the old spatial fracture, now a place of serene, quiet starlight, a single, monumental statue was erected by the Allied races. It was cast in dark, unpolished metal, honoring Bryant Bird and humanity. It stood as an eternal reminder of the species that did not return from the dark to conquer and rule, but returned to save the sky. The age of absolute control had died, and the beautiful, chaotic era of free learning had finally begun. Hello again, wonderful listeners, and thank you from the bottom of our hearts for staying with us until the very end of this epic journey. We would love to know where in the world you are listening to this story from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. As we mentioned earlier, our channel is currently operating with zero budget due to YouTube demonetization. If you found today's story thrilling and meaningful, please consider helping us with just a $1 donation. You can simply scan the QR code right here on your screen, or use the donation link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your $1 ensures our writers and voice actors can feed their families and keep creating these amazing universes for you to explore. Thank you for your incredible support, and we will see you in the next adventure.